Right to go. Welcome to the special meeting for April, the 20th of April 2022. This meeting is open to the public and will also be live streamed. I'd like to thank those of you in the room today and acknowledge everyone watching via Council's social media channels. I acknowledge the Mayor, Portfolio Leader Councillor Carl, councillors, the Acting CEO Nick Hauser and who's the delegate for the CEO, who's the General Manager of Environment and Community Services Group, and Acting Manager, General Manager Planning and Development Group, Michelle Milton. I acknowledge the Aboriginal parties whose songlines traverse these lands we meet on today, the Western Waka Waka, Guybil and Jarowair peoples, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the knowledge, the rich traditions and bold ambitions of Australia's First Peoples. We don't have any apologies and there are no leave of absences. I just need someone to move that we suspend standing orders, if I can, please. Councillor Melissa Taylor and Councillor McDonald, all those in favour? Okay. So we move to item number 4, which is our only item, and it's the material change of use impact food and drink outlet located at 117 to 119 Ruthven Street and 1 Jones Street, Harlexton.
Excuse me, Madam Chair.
Yes, Councillor Melissa Taylor.
My apologies. I just had a thought and it hadn't really occurred to me until now, but I don't see it as a conflict, but I just feel I need to say that I am a manager of Taylor's Removals and also own property at 131 North Street, which is down the road, which doesn't really have any bearing on this, but it is within the vicinity. So I will just indulge the meeting and ask for,
Any possible conflicts?
Yes,
Anyone
thank you.
who believes that Councillor Melissa Taylor might have a conflict?
No, I don't, Madam Chair, and perhaps the reason that I don't is because she has no greater or lesser advantage than any other resident in the region.
Okay, thank you. Anyone have any dissenting view on that? Okay, thanks, Councillor Taylor.
thank you.
Oh,
Madam
okay.
Chair, may I just ask a question?
Yes, Councillor Von Hoff.
If we've dealt with Councillor Melissa Taylor's issue?
I'll just get councillors to vote that Councillor Taylor can stay in the room. So all those in favour? Oh, mover and a seconder. Councillor McDonald moved and Councillor O'Shea second. All those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Yes, Councillor Von Hoff.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask, in the involved parties list, there's a David Quinlan listed, and I wondered if that raised any issues. I don't know if it is the same David Quinlan who we know from council, and if it is, if that raises any issues for us.
Councillor Von Hoff, it has been an issue and that's why we have engaged the external consultants to prepare this report. Mr Quinlan is here today on behalf of the submitters and will be speaking, but he is as a citizen and not an employee of Toowoomba Regional Council.
Okay, thank you very much.
Is there, councillors have any questions or?
I just think for clarity, if I could, I think it's appropriate that if he's here as a citizen, he should be sitting in the public chamber. I'm sorry, Dave, but I think that's the most appropriate way to go.
Okay, sure, no problem. Okay. Councillor Von Hoff, does that clear up any of your concerns?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I just didn't know, I can't see, so I didn't know that it was Mr Quinlan. Thank you.
Okay. So now the report has been prepared by Real Planning and we have Kieran, Ryan and Tim O'Leary here to present. Thank you. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone.
You're going to have to speak really closely to that microphone.
Is that better? Can everyone hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to come and present this report to you this afternoon. The Chair's mentioned, my name's Kieran Ryan. I'm a Principal Planner with Real Planning. We're a town planning consultancy in Brisbane, and we're engaged by Toowoomba Council to do a third-party assessment, of this application. Our involvement commenced in February of this year, and so in terms of the timeframe, the application was lodged in March 2021. It went through an information request prepared by Council, a response by the applicant, public notification whereby there were some submissions lodged, which we'll speak to, a further information request raising other issues, which was responded to by the applicant, and then subsequently we were engaged to review that material that had been lodged, both the requests and the responses, and prepare the decision report, which we have here in front of us. The application was an impact assessable application for a food and drink outlet at Ruthven Street, Harlexton. And I might ask if the site plan or the aerial photo could be placed on the screen, please. So that's attachment 3. Yes, and so 4 subsequently shows a closer of the site, but I'll just talk to 3 briefly, and just in terms of context, you can see there's 4 parcels which make up the site. They have frontage to both Ruthven Street and Jones Street to the south. The immediate south of Jones Street is the North Point Shopping Centre. On the opposite side of Ruthven Street is the school. And surrounding the site, you can see there's a number of predominantly houses to the north and immediate west. So the site in total is over 3,000 square metres, and access is via Jones Street. The proposal was for what's defined under Council's planning scheme as a food and drink outlet, which is a fast food restaurant, and the tenant is proposed to be McDonald's. It involves a single, sorry, I might just ask that the attachment 5 be put on the screen, please. Thank you, that's great. It involves a single building orientated towards the southeastern side of the site, with an access off Jones Street, a drive-through facility with queue in there for cars. That's about all I wanted to say in terms of context, and I thought what would be useful is for us to outline for you the core considerations we had in making our assessment of the application. So the site is in the low to medium density residential zone, and within that zone, it's in the urban residential precinct. There's no neighbourhood plan attaching to this part of the city, and the only overlays that were applicable related to the airport. The core planning issues, I think, start with it's a food and drink outlet in this zone, and this precinct is identified as an impact accessible use, so the entire planning scheme is relevant. The application is accessible against the whole planning scheme. The primary purpose of the residential zone, unsurprisingly, talks to the promotion of residential uses. There is an acknowledgement that there can be small non-residential uses there where they serve day-to-day convenience needs of the local community. But there is a restriction. So there's 2 tests which the code sets in the overall outcomes. Those tests involve things such as access and amenity. They also, and the second test which is relevant here, is that those uses are only anticipated in the urban consolidation precinct and the hospital precinct of this zone, so not the precinct that the subject site sits within. So there's a tension there in the zone code, which sends us to the strategic framework to see what it says around uses such as this. So you see there in the report, there's an assessment against the strategic framework. The strategic framework includes matters relating to the centre's hierarchy and maintaining the centre's hierarchy with the Toowoomba City Centre being the principal centre and your major centres around that down to your lower order centres. It talks to creating new centres. Our perspective with this proposal is that it's not a new centre. It is a centre activity. It's an extension to an centre, but it's not, the provisions relating to new centres aren't of relevance here. It talks to the strength of building the strength of residential areas and diversity in residential areas, and acknowledges that they will include employment generating activities. And finally, under economic need, it talks to out of centre uses. And I'll just turn to that quickly. And it says the outcome is to prevent out-of-centre uses that would detrimentally impact on the function and viability of the existing centres, activity centres. And so what's relevant here is that the applicants prepared an economic needs assessment and council's engaged a peer review of that assessment. And I think it's useful to identify some of the findings of that, and those were that there's no inappropriate impacts on the centre's hierarchy, that there's strong economic need, there's community need given the existing provision and distribution of activities like this. It would add to the choice, convenience and competition. And they looked at what other alternate sites were available within the zoned centre in Harlexton. And they found that there weren't any other sites that were appropriate for the use that's been proposed. So that's a sort of a summary, I guess, of the core planning considerations we had in our assessment. Other considerations involve the interface. We're putting a non-residential use in a residential area, so we had particular regard to how that sat with its neighbours. And relevant here is that the applicants prepared and council's engineers have reviewed an acoustic report, which recommended some acoustic fences on the boundaries. They prepared a landscape plan, which in the latest response softened some of the interfaces between those. They produced a stormwater report, of course, showing how there's no impact on adjoining properties. And finally, there was a landscape plan. The final matter was the shadow diagrams that were prepared that showed what impacts it would have at the summer and winter solstice. Other considerations we had, there's requirements in council's planning scheme that these out-of-centre activities don't gain access off a local road. The planning intent there is really not to drag non-residential traffic through residential streets. We had regard to the current function and of Jones Street and the fact that it also provides access to the North Point Shopping Centre. And we considered that was acceptable. We also had consideration to the bulk scale character provisions of the scheme in both the Centre Code and the low medium density zone code. And again, this was in terms of bulk and scale, it's quite a modest building on the size of the site, resulting in low site cover. There's some requirements there to interface the different street frontages, which weren't met. That's always difficult with a drive-through, but the applicant has gone to some lengths to provide a landscaped access to provide pedestrian entry into the building off the streets. So that's quite a quick summary, I think, of the sorts of matters we considered, but ultimately we found that whilst there was some performance outcomes sought, whilst there was that tension with the zone code, we thought that weighing up the different matters, including the economic report and council's peer review of that, that there were relevant matters in this case to justify approval, and the recommendation today is approval subject to conditions. I won't step through the conditions other than to say they seek to both manage ongoing construction and building matters, of course, and lock the applicant into the various undertakings they had with respect to stormwater and landscaping and the like. But also, councillors may note that there was also a requirement for upgrade works on Jones Street to improve the performance of that intersection. So that's all from me, but otherwise happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Kieran. I'm sure there'll be a few questions, starting with Councillor Carol Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I do have questions. I'll speak about it later. But I have a couple of questions. I see you have a queue of 15 vehicles there in the lineup. I'm aware that at KFC at Carney Springs, that it has a line, and it's in a private area, not on a council road, but it does go out onto a council road, that there's lines of cars impacting on every other business that's in that area at peak times, and there would be far more than 15 cars there. So I'm not convinced 15's enough. You might like to comment on that. But my main question is around the disability. One space in 37 spaces, in 37 car parks, one disability space. Is that normal? I don't believe it is.
Look, I'd pass to council's engineers with respect to traffic matters. We're guided by the assessment that they undertook with respect to traffic, so that deals with your queuing question. I can't talk to that directly, unfortunately. My understanding is that the PWD parking is in accordance with.
Well, I don't believe it's
council
acceptable. I'm sorry.
Standards.
And then, I mean, the fact is around this shopping centre, at peak times, the traffic is erratic and congested. And, you know, so much so that TMR are trying to find a solution to it, and they've met with ISG many times over this. So we're just putting, I'll talk about the rest of it later, but I'm not convinced about those two things. I'm sorry, but I'm not convinced about it.
Thank you.
Councillor Taylor, we might get Craig Thompson to come and speak about the traffic issues. Don't go too far away, Kieran, I don't think.
Good afternoon, councillors. The first question related to the length of queue. The traffic report indicates that there is space for 15 vehicles to queue, but I'm not sure where that point is taken from, but if you look at the diagram there, you can see that there is actually more space than 15, well, there's more cars than 15 actually able to queue. It's at the far end of the site. If they needed more queuing area than shown on that drawing, they'd simply queue back through the aisle. It's a long way from the queuing collection point to the street. Your second question,
The PWD parking.
PWD parking, yes, you're right. There is a federal legislation gives a rate for PWD car parking, and my recollection is it's 1 per 50 car spaces. In this case here, they've actually overprescribed in terms of car parking, so they are providing in excess of the number of car parks that they require under our Transport Access and Parking Code. So if you're really concerned about it, there could be provision made to provide an extra one. And the third question relating to the general traffic in the area itself has been addressed in the initial traffic impact assessment by Rayburn and Bryant, and an information request response which came in as well. And they've actually taken measurements of existing traffic, projected the additional traffic due to the development, analysed not just the Jones Street and Ruthven Street intersection, but the intersection further south. Their first analysis identified that there was going to be queuing past the entrance to the shopping centre and to McDonald's. Their subsequent mitigation works included the additional left turn lane at the signals, in addition to some changes in phasing at the signals themselves. As a consequence of that, Department of Transport and Main Roads has accepted their solution, and they've actually conditioned, and there is one of the attachments that shows their conditions, the condition of the upgrade works that the traffic impact assessment has identified.
And the other thing, I mean, this Jones Road, until it gets just down, it's actually mainly a neighbourhood road, except for the turnout from North Point Shopping Centre, leading down to the velodrome and the park that people use in that area. Anyway, I'll leave the rest of it, but it seems we need to try to find a way to get this over the line rather than try to see what impacts it's going to have on the community.
Councillor Shine. Thank you, Craig.
Thanks, Chair. Probably to Kieran, I think. It says in the report that you've either prepared or reviewed. I'm not too sure. Is this an officer's report or as opposed to Kieran's? Or?
This is our report.
This
is our report, yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, on page 44, you indicate that there is strong economic need. I'm just wondering what evidence is there of that strong economic need for these premises?
Yep, so the economic need, we refer to both the economic report of the applicant as well as the peer review that the peer reviewer that council engaged. And both those reports were in agreement with each other that there was economic need for this proposal.
You know what evidence that those reports came to those conclusions?
Look, I wouldn't be able to put my finger on the specifics of the statistics they looked at, but it's my understanding as a town planner is that it's a consideration of the utilisation of these activities, so of fast food restaurants, the spacing of where they exist elsewhere in Toowoomba, as well as a consideration, the sort of flip side to that is, the catchment that they identify and the population that it will serve. So there'll be some statistics about the number of people that frequent fast food restaurants, and if this didn't exist, where they would be going to. And then the flip side to that, of course, is an assessment of the impacts it would have to other fast food restaurants or restaurants in the area to ensure that the creation of this restaurant wouldn't cause others to fail.
Okay. You're aware that it's next to North Point Shopping Centre, where there's various food outlets, fish and chips and
Yes.
sushi and all sorts of things. Further up the road, at the corner of Ruffin Street and just over the bridge and at Red Rooster at, what's the street name?
Griffith Street.
It is.
Griffith Street, yeah. There is a similar sort of outlet, chicken and chips, etc. So would they necessarily have been taken into account as well, the effect on those businesses?
Yeah, look, apologies, I can't point to the exact matters that the economists took into account, but we were certainly given by some comfort by the peer review that council engaged that agreed with the methodology and the findings of the applicant's report.
Right. On page 42 of our it says under urban design, the proposed development does not incorporate front building elements such as verandas and front porches. One assumes that that's desirable under urban design in the normal course. Any comment as to the absence of those features?
Look, certainly it was a consideration. Sorry, I must apologise. I'm struggling to just pinpoint on page 42.
Page 37 of the report, of your report, about the third item down, 3.5.4.
Yes, that's right. So within and this is this is within the strategic framework. So there's parts of the strategic framework which will be relevant to all development. That's development across the city, and it seeks particular urban design outcomes, including and obviously relevant in a place like Toowoomba with its historic and character buildings, that those design elements be replicated through new development, and that's that's multiple things: subtropical living, verandas, front porches, and the like. And the reality of this development is that it is a fit for purpose fast food restaurant with a drive-through, and so those things simply don't exist on this development. So I guess the mitigated slightly, I think, through landscaping and design, but you certainly can't hide. I think there's two things. You can't hide from the fact that those aspects don't exist on this design, but I'd also just make the point that that's a provision which is intended to apply across the city. So inevitably it won't be achievable on every development through industry and commercial and others.
Okay. From looking at the design of the building, do you anticipate it will be a standard Macca's type construction? The normal, I'm not too sure if they all look alike or there's similarity amongst most of them.
Yeah, look, I mean, certainly Macca's has a certain theme to it. I couldn't comment whether it'll be like others that are in Toowoomba. I know that there was certainly, and quite rightly, council in its information request sought some design amendment to soften the interface with Jones Street in particular and bring that pedestrian entry in. So I think it will be different in some ways, but there's no doubt the colour scheme and things will be similar to other McDonald's you see around Queensland.
I see. Then lastly on page 27 of your report, at the top of it, it says that this proposal aligns with community sentiment. How was that derived, that knowledge that it was in alignment with community sentiment? Right at the top, corporate plan reference.
Yep. So I think this is a fairly broad statement and relates back to the corporate plan, which says that seeks to ensure that development aligns with community sentiment through effective and efficient assessment with the planning scheme, planning instruments, codes and legislation. What we do as part of our assessment is to balance various positive and negative aspects of all developments. And certainly, we've identified some tensions both within design aspects, some of which you've pointed to, with some tensions within the zone codes, but we've also weighed that up against, for instance, the findings of the economic needs study, which identified those needs. So I guess it's a balancing exercise to get to where we got to.
But it's not based on any surveys as to what community sentiment might be.
No, that's right. I mean, I guess the community is engaged at the time of preparing the planning scheme, and which points to where these things should go, and sets a framework, sets a criteria for where they, what considerations you have to go where they're located outside those areas, which are the considerations we had here today. There's also the public notification allowance that this application's gone through to get an idea of where the public stands on it.
Thank
I
you.
might just take this opportunity to check. Councillor Vonhoff, you're online. How are you going with the volume and the audio?
I was going really well, thanks, Chair, until about 2 minutes ago, and after Councillor Shine's question, I couldn't really hear much after that.
So can you hear the planner? Can you hear Kieran speaking?
I've been hearing Kieran well until just the last 2 minutes. I don't know what's happened.
Can you hear me now?
Barely, but I'll just come in. I've come really close to my little device here.
Sorry,
Just checking in.
I'll try and stay close to it.
Maybe just
Oh, that's amazing. That's amazing. Whatever you're doing
Something-
now is perfect. Thank you.
well, just interrupt if you can't hear, because it's very frustrating, I know, and you can't hear what's going on. Okay?
I'm not
Thank
too,
you.
All right.
Chair, I'm not too sure that the councillors require me to repeat all the questions. So, thank you.
Councillor Shine's just asking whether he needs to repeat his questions. He's joking, I'm sure, Councillor Von Hoff. Now, you had finished, Councillor Shine? Yep. Councillor Summerfield.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I've got a few questions. Bear with me, please.
Sure.
So you addressed economic need before, and yet I have recollections of yourself, Councillor Taylor, you're nodding your head, and a number of us asking questions previously about economic need, and we've been told that we're not allowed to address that. So I was surprised that that was raised, to be honest. But I wanted some clarification around extension to a centre, not a new centre, because, so can you explain to me, if it's an extension of a centre, was that in the original proposal that was approved for North Point at that time? So was this included in that at that time?
So if I think, please stop me if I get your question wrong. There's a subtlety in the way that the strategic framework deals with new centres versus what we're saying this is, which is an extension. And so a new centre would be a centre which is the size of and competes with other centres. So if you had, for instance, if you look at something using North Point as an example, it's a supermarket-based centre with a number of specialties and other uses surrounding it. If the consideration, there's different considerations in the strategic framework for something of that scale versus what this is, which is a centre use, but not a whole new centre in itself. It's a single tenancy,
Okay.
and so there's different provisions in the strategic framework to deal with those two separate things.
I understand, thank you. So then I've been looking in here for two maps. They may be there and I haven't been able to find them, but I was looking for a map that actually showed the neighbouring homes and what it looked like from an aerial perspective for them. When you see that driveway, the drive-through for McDonald's is right against the fence, which would be right against potentially someone's house next door. And this is suggesting 24/7 opening hours. And if you have someone in a Monaro, boom, 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 driving through that driveway at midnight, no one's going to be sleeping next door.
Yeah.
And no acoustic wall is going to stop that. It might stop a quiet car, but generally in the middle of the night, it's not quiet cars, right? So I am really concerned that of the, thank you, the impact on the neighbouring homes. And I would have thought that would have been a map that should have been included in this. And then the other map that I'm looking for and can't find is the traffic management one, which I believe normally is attached to these sorts of things. And that is not just the site and where the traffic comes out, but the street, the next door property and the street that it joins onto and where the traffic flow works. And I can't see that. Can you advise me if I've missed it in the report, please?
Look, I'm not sure that it forms an attachment to the report. There was a series of traffic reports that were considered. Sorry, I'm very conscious of being close to the microphone. There was a series of traffic reports that were considered as part of the application. I can't talk for Toowoomba Council. Different councils take different approaches as far as including those technical reports as part of the approval. In this one, I know we have the stormwater report and acoustic report, for instance, but the traffic report would have formed part of the common material, part of the application material. That was with the application.
Thank you. So I'm just looking at this photo that's been put in front of me, and that fence is right against that house that joins on. So you're going to have vehicles driving on one side of that fence against a house on the other side of the fence in the middle of the night, any time between sun going down and sun coming up again, when someone's trying to sleep, and they're going to have cars driving straight along the side of their fence, straight along the side of their bedroom potentially. I find that really challenging.
Councillor
Thank you.
Summerfield, I might just get Luke to, I thought from the aerial shot that those two are two garages along the edge of that fence there and that the houses face onto, is it Wattle Street at the back? But Luke, did you want to just talk to Councillor Summerfield's query?
Thank you. Through your chair, councillor. Those two houses that you can see immediately above the ES in Jones Street, that house will be removed as part of this development, if not already removed. I believe it has already been removed. And then the structures at the rear of the two lots, which is number 1 and number 2, Wattle Street, they are sheds at the rear of it, and the houses are closer to the west rather than the development site. So you will see through the site plans that the proposed driveway is going to go basically where that house above the ES in Jones is going to go, and there's a level of separation.
Now, I think, through you, Madam Chair, I think you might be confused about what I'm trying to say. I'm talking about the people north of the
So
of the
I beg your
development.
pardon, yes. So
And
the
driveway for the McDonald's
The
is right
drive-through
along
2
that
bays,
fence.
yes, is going to go very, very close to that. We received a noise
Right on.
report that includes a full operational hour of vehicles continuously cycling through that drive-through. It was required to have a noise barrier fence in there, which was included in the model, and then it takes the drive-through separation, distances, etc., from the house, from the facades, noise bouncing around a little bit between the two facades to see whether or not those levels would be appropriate, and those levels did come back as under the compliance limits as determined noise criteria as set by our planning scheme.
Thank you. I'm just concerned that it may be an electric vehicle versus my Monaro I talked about earlier, which is going boom, 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 going through that driveway. And I can't, in my mind, understand how it could possibly meet the pub test of going through that driveway at midnight when noise is always much louder anyway in the middle of the night, as we know. And you've got a loud vehicle coming through that driveway of McDonald's, right against that fence, with the neighbours just directly on the opposite side.
When we're assessing the noise report, we're looking for the sound power of the vehicles going through it and whether or not they're deemed to be reasonable. We can't include every single car on the planet and every design spec, and whether or not someone's done some modification to a vehicle that may be legal or illegal, but we're looking at those vehicle emissions from a drive-through area, which has to be a certain size vehicle, so we're limiting it predominantly to light cars. And then, is that appropriate? We're looking for the duration and the number of those events over a particular monitoring period or a compliance period, which in this case is over a single hour, and does that fall under the limits? What the applicant and the noise consultant provided was monitoring data taken from a point to the rear of the site, almost, I'm going to call it a pool, forgive me if it's not a pool, but it's, again, not there at the moment, towards the rear of the site. So over a period of several days, continuous monitoring to determine what the background levels are. They then apply a lower 90% statistical line through that noise, so it's not the top noise that you hear, it's the bottom 10% that sets a limit. That is classified in day, evening and night. The distance of the microphone from the road, both road frontages, is set back. So you've actually got some very good representation of what noise should be closer to those rear receptors. And what that effectively does is, if they had have placed the microphone right on Ruthven Street, they would have actually had a very loud noise level that they could try and find compliance with, and we would have questioned that. Being located where they are, further away from the noise sources in North Point shops and also on Ruthven Street, etc., they've effectively had to lower their noise level that they have to comply with. And then once we've checked all of the inputs into the model, the output of the model is telling us that they can still comply.
Thank you. I appreciate that you do your work through the guidelines that you're provided with, but I'm
Yes,
still
Councillor.
going back to my Monaro going boom, 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 boom. Sorry. I do believe there is potential on this site, but I'm not sure that the design is right in relation to respect for the neighbourhood is
Yes.
where I'm thinking.
The only thing else I can refer councillors to is that we also, when we're checking these, we look for similar developments and what they're doing. And so apart from our own knowledge and when we're looking at these reports and the inputs and the model outputs, we've also got other examples of other sites where we've got reports that are submitted, and we do cross-check a little bit. We've got scenarios where at the moment where we do have drive-throughs proposed for houses at a similar distance between the proposed development and that one to the north along Ruthven Street as well. And we do find that their acoustic barriers can work. And so when a report presents that information to us, we have to accept what that report is given to us once we've accepted all of the inputs into that.
So could I just have one follow-up, please, Madam Chair? So can you tell me how thick this acoustic wall is so that
It's not so much the thickness, it's the density that's important, because a lighter material, a really thin plywood, won't have the density which will then stop the noise passing through it. So what we want is a particular density specified within our conditions. You must be a certain height and a particular density. So the material that they can use could be anything. It could be concrete, it could be a perspex, it could be wood, it could be a concrete MDF, who knows, whatever, for it. But it's that density that's required to stop the noise travelling through it, which then feeds into the model about how noise travels around the rest of the site after it's rebounded off those barriers.
Okay, and the height of the wall?
2 metres.
2. Thank you.
Does change throughout the site. We've got an approved site plan which shows where those heights do change.
Councillor Summerfield, I might get Michelle to comment on your first query about the economic need.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Summerfield, that was an excellent question to ask. I think when we consider planning need, there's an economic need and a community need, but then there's also competition. And so one of the things that we are not able to consider is the nature of competition as a prevailing planning circumstance in which we can base decisions. But there is sufficient evidence and certainly a number of appeals and even references into other planning legislation that has referred to community and economic need. And having a specialist report, my understanding listening to Kieran today is that the methodology used in that report has been peer reviewed by council's engaged economic specialist. It was found to be a sound methodology that considered issues around catchment, population. It would have probably considered local expenditure versus passing trade, and it would have taken into account the impact on other centres. What it wouldn't have done is individualised impact on competition for particular businesses. It will look at it as a centre-based activity and the impact of that, and also the broader community need in terms of is there sufficient services of this type within this particular catchment or secondary trade catchment. So you are very correct in what there are some things that might be perceived to be of an economic nature, but the specifics of that on individual businesses are not something that we would ordinarily be able to take into account, but we can take into account broader impacts, if that is a helpful explanation. I'm not sure.
Councillor Carl.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I'm going to jump around a bit because the topics would have been probably better covered as each topic rather than jump back and forwards, but forgive me. Luke, thanks for your explanation about the noise, but I suspect if I was living in one of those two houses at the north, I'd be dreaming about fries with everything. From the loudhailers, not from the cars. It's a challenge. I would hate to be living there. But I guess while we're on the subject of needs, was there any consideration through you, Chair, sorry, I forgot.
Kieran.
Jared. Sorry, Jared. Was there any consideration around, when we talk about economic needs and community sentiment, was there any consideration given to the matter of exposure to school children across the road from Fast Food Alley and the associated risks with, dare I say, a lack of wholesome variety in a diet. It's all well and good to establish things on planning grounds, but we're talking about people here. And it's not the first time as a councillor I've sat around this table and been exposed to the concerns and sentiment of the broader community around, well, I will say this as sensitively as I can, a number of at-risk children at the school across the road.
The short answer to your question is no. The current framework that surrounds, and there was a great explanation of economic need that we consider being economic, community and planning need. They don't take into consideration the operator, the types of food that the operator serves and what broader health implications that has for the community. So is a McDonald's better or worse than a Subway that's better or worse than a coffee shop, for instance? So the short answer is no, that's not something that's taken into account in this assessment.
Yep, a couple more questions if I may. And look, I sensitively said a variety in diet, a wholesome diet, not singling out any particular outlet. Was there, as far as the traffic goes, was there any consideration to peak periods? And by that I mean I personally witness on my way to work, and if it's late enough from work, traffic frequenting these takeaway drive-through areas, accessing a main trunk route, I mean the main northern route, and the already existing problems that I witness on a daily basis as a resident in Highfields, with many other thousands of people traversing their way to and from work. Was there consideration in the traffic impact studies around peak periods?
Yeah, look, I can certainly pass over to people that are better in the know than me about that, but certainly my understanding and experience dealing with traffic reports through any number of developments we do is they look at the worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario inevitably falls in the morning and afternoon peaks. Whether that coincides with peak trading periods, for instance, with this restaurant or just outside is a question I can't answer for you, but certainly traffic reports are always based on a worst case scenario, and the worst case scenario is more often than not those peak periods, peak morning, afternoon periods.
Yeah, look, I'm suggesting that it's not necessarily adding additional traffic to the thoroughfare, it's actually changing the habit of that traffic and wanting to enter and exit a normal flow of traffic that it interrupts. That's a concern, particularly in Jones Street and particularly in North Street, particularly with that whole area, is a bit of a nightmare with the traffic lights. And a school adjacent in a 40k zone where you often witness frustration with traffic on a daily basis. The other question I had...
Councillor Carl, did you want Craig to make a comment on that? Or?
Oh, if Craig would like to. I mean, I suspect the answer that I've been given is yes, it would have been considered.
Craig's nodding his head. It has been considered. Okay.
Thank you. Jeremy, you said the other considered sites, they considered other sites, but they weren't considered suitable. Was that depending on the criteria of exposure to through traffic? Is that one of their priorities, why they don't consider other sites in that immediate vicinity? I mean, to me, there would have been some suitable sites to the west of the shopping centre.
Yep. So my recollection from the report is that they considered 2 sites. They only looked at sites which were zoned appropriately, so sites that were within that centre zone. And the primary reason, again, my recollection is that one of them was quite an odd shape, and the other one wasn't of sufficient size. So I think the primary considerations were certainly size and configuration, I'm not sure whether they went so far as to consider exposure as well.
I suspect it would be. I mean, they've been doing it for a long time.
Look, there's no doubt in my mind that McDonald's, chooses their sites based on a number of criteria, including exposure to major road thoroughfares. So I would agree with that.
And one final question, Madam Chair, and then I'm done. Was there any opportunity in discussing this with the applicant for a different site layout to minimise the impact to immediate neighbours? Was there any deliberation or discussion about how they might amend that site layout?
Yeah. So, look, certainly in Council's information request and further issues letter, and I think in both those letters, the interface was high up the priority list in terms of questions that were asked to them. And it was both in terms of mitigating impacts, sort of hard impacts in terms of acoustics, as well as what I call softer impacts, which are the view of retaining walls and fences from properties. Whether there was ever a request from Council, I don't think there was ever a request from Council to revise the layout per se, just to deal with those interfaces.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Councillor Carr. Councillor O'Shea.
Thanks, Madam Chair. A few of the questions I had have probably been answered. The only other one, I just wanted an explanation around, in the assessment, it talks about the site is contained in the low, medium density residential zone, etc. And within that it would, it referred somewhere in only small scale services to cater for local residents. So I guess if you're living in the neighbourhood and you thought maybe a small-scale service would potentially be in my neighbourhood, I don't think generally you would think McDonald's would be classified in that category. However, what's small-scale, what's medium? Because that one I find hard to fathom.
So I think in some respects I'm trying to get myself into the mind of the scheme drafter, but I think as a general planning principle, what you'll find is that there'll be the centre hierarchy, which I referred to before, starting with your city centre and moving down to your major shopping centres, all the way down to your local groups of shops, which would typically be a neighbourhood centre. There's a general acceptance that in your residential areas, there'll still be a need to have some non-residential uses. They're not entirely residential all the time. But the limitation put on that is that it should be small scale to serve local needs. So what I think, probably a little bit of plan in theory, but it sort of harps back to the corner store, maybe the local GP, maybe the local accountant that would set up in residential areas. And look, there's certainly no suggestion that McDonald's fits that bill, that they are small scale. But I think that expectation that some, and just to finish that point, that's why the assessment moved to the strategic framework and moved to look at how the strategic framework of the planning scheme deals with outer centre development and what considerations it has. Look, I don't think there's any thought that McDonald's would fit the criteria for being a small-scale service with local needs. Certainly it will service some local people, but it'll also draw in some trade.
Probably an example of one thing we've always said, planning's not black and white, because that's pretty... As I said, if you were living in that area and you thought something small scale, exactly the services you described, a corner store or something like that, I don't think anyone would consider I appreciate the explanation.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Melissa Taylor.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Kieran. And again, a lot of my questions have been answered. But I still don't have clarification, or feel I don't have clarification, on the impact of coming out of North Point onto Jones Street. So when you're looking at the proposed site for McDonald's, there's only that one entrance in and out on Jones Street, which is only slightly diagonal. Sorry, can we just go back to the aerial shot, please, Wendy? Sorry, because that's just a little bit clearer. Yeah. So that entrance in and out of the proposed site is slightly, and I mean ever so slightly really, in the grand scheme of things, diagonal to that entrance into North Point. Now, I've sat on that steep entry and exit into North Point many a time, and I have witnessed some atrocious traffic behaviour because of the impatience of already getting in and out of North Point. Because they line up on that driveway to get out, because you can only fit, I can't remember, 4 or 5, correct me if I'm wrong, 6 or 7? Yeah, but on the actual street, on Jones Street before the lights, there's not many cars that can come out of the shopping centre onto Jones Street. So therefore it banks up on into the shopping centre. So then you're going to add another entrance to the McDonald's side, so you're going to add more traffic into that already congested entrance. So to me, that just doesn't make sense. I've witnessed it, I've seen it, I've nearly had a prang or two myself because of the, not me, can I just say, the impatience of other people trying to get in and out. And then you've also got pedestrians up and down that street as well. And they can take their life into their own hands because they scream in and out of the North Point entrance and they're not looking for pedestrians. So that's probably my biggest concern, is that entrance in and out of Jones Street on an already congested side street.
Is that another question for you, Craig?
So, councillors, just to reiterate, there is extra capacity being provided in Jones Street with an additional turn lane. So at the moment we have a situation where traffic queues across the shopping centre entrance, and it's projected that the traffic would queue across McDonald's entrance as well. So to mitigate the impact, the engineers redesigned the intersection. And it's not just the extra lane they've provided on Jones Street that has changed, it's also the phasing of the lights, the signals, the traffic signals. And it's also linked back to the intersection, the signalised intersection further south. So the solution they have not just reduces, it reduces the queue lengths on Jones Street, it also reduces the queue lengths on Ruthven Street, but that's an aside. So as far as main roads and the traffic impact assessment is concerned, the development impacts have been mitigated by that treatment.
Thank you. Not quite convinced on that, but just from an experience point of view, it's so hectic there. And then you add the school and peak times, and then you add wet weather, and it goes ballistic there. And also, that whole North Point Centre actually on North and Ruthven is diabolical as well. You take your life into your own hands, then you add a couple of trucks in there too.
Okay. So just explaining that again, so that it's been reworked, that whole intersection, and is there there's more than one lane now? Is that the...
So Jones Street only has one queuing lane at the moment.
Yeah.
There is an additional queuing lane provided for the left turn movements out. There is a change in the phasing. At the moment, the signals only operate on 2 phases. So they changed it to 4 phases. And as a result of all that, the queue lengths on Jones Street reduced considerably. And the traffic impact assessment confirms that there is no queuing across the North Point driveway or the McDonald's driveway.
Okay, all right. Is that on the same topic? Because I've got Councillor McMahon who hasn't had a go yet. Okay, Councillor Carl, sorry.
So with the change in the phase of lights, does that simply mean that there will be more frequent stops on Ruthven Street, whilst you might have less queuing, but there's more frequent stops to let the greater volume of traffic on Jones Street out onto Ruthven Street?
Sorry, I can't answer that simplistically. All I can say is that the changes to the signalised intersection result in reduce queue lengths on Jones Street. I can't tell you I can't recall what the cycle frequencies of the traffic signals were as per design, as per the traffic impact assessment. I can't answer that off the top of my head, I'm sorry.
So that is a concern as a person familiar with the cycles of those lights now. It can be, it's frustrating now. So an increase in the phasing of those lights potentially means that there's a disruption, whether it's a result of longer queues or not, there has to be logically a disruption to Rutherford Street.
So the applicant has to go back to Department of Transport and Main Roads and get a permit to upgrade those signals. And as part of that, there will be a change in the signal operation, which Main Roads would have to agree to. And they're also linking it to the intersection, the signalised intersection to the south. So the two of them are they're all coordinated, if you like. Now, I can't tell you exactly how that would work. It's beyond my expertise, but that's the way the traffic impact assessment has presented the mitigation works, which has been accepted by Main Roads.
So Councillor Taylor, just on that same
Thank
topic.
you. Yes, it is, Madam Chair. Thank you. And I'm very aware that every time you add phasing and change phasing, of course it has impacts, and those two signalled intersections will slow down the traffic in what is already a 40k an hour school zone in the front of there. And as Councillor Melissa has mentioned before, all those things, I can't be convinced. I'm pleased I don't live in that area and don't travel it every day, because it is an absolute dog's breakfast. And of course, every time you add or change the signal phasing, you add time to we're changing it for Jones Street so that there'll be less queuing. So then we're interrupting the traffic that's up on the New England Highway. And that goes without saying. That, of course, will happen.
Okay. Councillor McMahon.
Thanks, Chair. Problem with being last, all of your questions are answered, but I suppose I share Councillor Summerfield's concern about the cars in the northern part of the block in the drive-through, and I would like to look at perhaps conditioning a bit of a change in the layout of the block. I share in part Councillor Carl's concerns around the school across the road, and I know it only goes to grade 6, but imagine sitting in class looking at the Golden Arches all day, keeping in mind they do have access one block down to North Point, which has a range of fast food options anyway. But the main concern, and Councillor O'Shea brought it up, and my question was very much in line, and if we could perhaps revisit it for a third time, Kieran. Low, medium residential, which is houses, and you're allowed small scale and low intensity in a low to medium residential area, right? We've agreed that a Macca's is not small scale, nor is it low intensity. We've agreed that the priority in a low to medium residential is residential. I take note of page 43 of the report, or 38 of the report, 43 on board books, talking about the low, medium density residential, and it says it is not considered to comply with the acceptable outcomes and performance outcomes of this code as identified further in the table. Therefore, the application is required to look at the idea of overall outcomes. And then so whichever way you look at it, it's not supposed to be put in an area that is low to medium residential, i.e. houses. And I would propose that the small scale or low intensity, way back when this was written, might have been old mate putting his avocados for sale out the front of his house or something. But then we get to, all of that says it's not allowed here, but the choice idea says we are allowed here. That's the part I'm not getting. All of these things say you're not allowed, but then on balance we are. Just need you to step through that process for me again. And sorry that you're repeating yourself several times. But
No, that's okay. So look, your questions a good one, and I guess it's the, you know, I described it before as a balancing of these matters, and so I guess to try and distill it down, I don't think we're here saying that this is small scale and anticipated in the zone, and that's why, as you say, we've looked at other things at the strategic framework. The strategic framework gives us some guidance when things are not anticipated in the zone, and it talks to ensuring that the viability of places where these things are anticipated, in this case the centre, is not compromised. And so that's where we got to the economic report, which said that is the case. We ticked that box in the strategic framework to say that it's an outer centre use, but it's not compromising the centre. We look at what are the positive attributes of this, and there'll be varying, and there is varying views in this room about what positive attributes would be. But if you come from the perspective, as the economist did, that this is a choice people make to frequent fast food, and that they are travelling across the city now. You know, people that enjoy this particular tenant are travelling across the city now to achieve that. There is a catchment which will support this, which will economically support this. So that's your choice and your competition advantages. We also have those considerations of accepting that this is not a site which anticipates to have it. Are there any other sites which are available, which council should look at and say, well, this isn't just a preference, you know, this isn't just because you've managed to amalgamate these blocks of lands, therefore you get to go there. You should be going in the centre. Are there any other locations in this catchment which are appropriately zoned? And that was an assessment done by the economist, not by the applicant. So council's peer review economist. So as you know, as I think is independent evidence as we have here today, and they looked at what sites were available and appropriately zoned and said that, you know, they're not suitable for the particular use that's been proposed. And I think the other relevant consideration, of course, is knowing that the developer, the applicant, wants to establish, is it better to have it on this site, which is not appropriately zoned but is across the road from an appropriately zoned site, or is it better that it's a kilometre up the road, well away from other centres, and what additional impacts might that bring if it's not here and it ends up going somewhere else? And again, probably to round that out, and you know, we do have experience assessing out-of-centre applications. I was in the Planning Environment Court giving evidence in December about an out-of-centre use, and certainly the view the court takes is that if there is need and if there's an absence of impacts, and again, I understand there's varying views in the room about that, and certainly, you know, we as planners are guided by other experts, by acoustic engineers and traffic engineers about what those impacts, whether they do or don't exist. But where there's need and where there's an absence of impacts, you know, this is an acceptable form of development. So that's where we got to in our report.
Right. No, thanks for clarifying. That means a lot. It seems weird that whatever way you look at it, and you've written that here in your report, a need, community and economic need overrides zoning. And, you know, this is a housing area, but heck, there's need. Away we go. I don't think I'll ever understand that idea, but thanks for stepping me through it as best you can.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'm up to Melissa Taylor. You okay? Councillor McDonald.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you very much. Through you to Kieran. Kieran, was there any, maybe it's to traffic, was there any consideration of a left-in, left-out to this site rather than what it currently is proposed?
I'm sorry, I can't answer that question for you.
Back to you, Craig.
Thanks, Craig.
Just to clarify, you're talking about McDonald's?
Yeah, into that site.
Off Ruthven Street, yeah.
Yeah.
No, off Jones Street.
Off Jones Street,
Oh.
Jones Street, left in, left out.
No, I cannot recall any consideration of that. There was a question earlier about where the traffic was coming from and where the traffic diagram was. There is a traffic diagram. It's in the traffic impact assessment reports, which haven't been presented today, but they were supplementary. 25% of the traffic is estimated to come from the west, 75% is estimated to come from through Ruthven Street intersection, and 60% of the trips would be drop-in trips, which means traffic already on the network, but which might be heading north, for instance, on Ruthven Street, which have to turn left at the intersection of Jones Street to access McDonald's and come back out again. So if you were to make it a left in, left out arrangement, you would be cutting off a fair amount of traffic being able to access that site.
Yeah, no, and obviously then you shift the impact into Parrot Street and what have you if they go, left and then around behind North Point to get up there. But I just, I think the issues are clear, the traffic and around the amenity in regard to the noise. So if that has not been considered, is it something that would be worth considering?
In my opinion, no, because the biggest desire line is from Ruthven Street, and I don't know that there would be enough traffic drawn into the site having to detour down North Street and up Parrot Street, for instance. They might just decide to go head north and go to the next
up to Kerry's chicken shop. Okay, thank you for that. Second question is in regard to the amenity and particularly around the acoustics with the heights. So it might well be Mr. Jackson, I'm not too sure, but it's around. If I look at the noise report on our board books, it's page 129, which may not help you, Kieran. Whatever page it is on your report, it's in the noise management. Effectively, what I'm trying to find is on the western boundary, and the comment was made that it's 2.4 on the northern boundary where the cars will go down. It shortens as you get closer to Ruthven Street. But on the western side, it's 2 metres. That's the acoustic fence. But there's also the slope of the land, which means it'll be above the retaining wall. And I just couldn't really tell from this picture, but it looks like it might be close to a 5 metre from ground to the top of that, from the back of, and albeit they may be sheds at the moment, but who's to know what may be in those 2 houses or 2 blocks to the west. And I just wondered if there was a way to tell what that height, ground level to the top of the acoustics might be.
Yeah, so that was one of the issues raised in Council's last further issues letter to the applicant, and in response they pushed the retaining wall and acoustic fence back into the site, and then which allowed for some space for landscaping in front of that. So it's both setback from the boundary as well as landscape to soften the impacts. I looked at the measurements and certainly I got to about under 4 metres on the sections that I had in terms of total height.
Yeah, thank you. Just explain to me now they're going into their own site, but there's landscaping which would be still in their site but on the neighbour's property. Is that how I read that?
It would be on their property, also on the McDonald's property.
Yeah, on their property, but
yes.
How would they access that to maintain the landscaping?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure what discussions were had. You can put gates in acoustic fences to get through and maintain it. So there'd be a requirement in council's conditions to maintain it, and there'd be ways for them to get through and do that.
I'm just picturing maybe a fence of the property behind it, and then a gap of a distance for landscaping, and then the 4 metre high wall, stretching the distance of those 2 properties on the western side. That's what I'm picturing in my mind. Is that what you're explaining?
It's not. So moving from north to south, there's the wall and the retaining wall and fence are set back in the northern area, and then as you come south and you have the dog leg in the property, it moves back to the boundary at that point. But by then the retaining wall heights are lower, so you're down to, I can't remember the exact, I think it's 2.5, 2.6 metres total combined height.
So given the amenity, I would say it would be less than optimal for a property owner looking to the looking to the towards Ruthven Street in behind there, and then the amenity, be it noise, whatever it may be, on the properties to the north of the site. Are there any conditions that you could see that could be implemented in this to actually mitigate that issue even further?
Look, the noise issue, I think, is, to my mind, again, as a planner, talking to it is a straight technical one. So you can achieve greater noise attenuation with higher fences and different materials. So you could achieve something more than the standard, although I don't know what, I just question the basis of seeking an applicant to achieve more than the standard that's in your planning scheme or the legislation. Look, certainly you could impose conditions which sought different outcomes in terms of the retaining of the acoustic fence. So, for instance, there's acrylic panels and things that you can put up which ensure that there's more light gets through and it's not as an imposing structure as a straight solid. So certainly that's an option to you. The option chosen by the applicant in this case to set the wall back and have some landscaping in there is obviously a good one because it helps soften the combined height of those things. So there is certainly things you could do to soften the view from the west.
Thank you. It sounds like most of that's been taken care of in any respect. From an operating hours perspective, which it's 24 hours, is that correct?
That's right, yes.
But they can only do deliveries of larger vehicles from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m.?
Yes.
That's right?
Yeah, there's a limitation on the operating hours for servicing, that's right.
That's right. So in regard to the banking up of cars in the drive-through section where we've got 2 lanes in that section, and understanding that it would restrict the numbers of cars that would be there and you could service, given the car park and its extended area, would it be something that you could have just 1 lane entered in there closest to the building rather than have 2 lanes and leave more space, or does that make no difference at all from a sound perspective?
I think it would, look, it might improve the scenario, sort of a double barrel question, but it might improve the scenario from an acoustic perspective. But again, I go back to, if they meet the standard with their current design, what are we trying to achieve above and beyond that? And we just have to also be conscious, and just thinking out loud here, we'd have to be conscious of the loss of queue in space and what other impacts that might have in trying to achieve that outcome.
Right, thanks.
Thanks, Councillor. Councillor Taylor, did you have another question?
I don't have a question, Madam Chair. Well, I do, I guess. If you go back to 38 there, it says the purpose of a low, medium density residential zone code is to provide for a range and mix of dwelling types, including dwelling houses, multiple dwelling. It's all there. This area would be perfect. We're running around tripping over ourselves, worrying about the housing crisis and land that's available. This area is perfect for medium density housing. It's close to bus stops, it's close to parklands, close to the school, and it's already serviced by a shopping centre. And I actually, the shopping centre that's there at the moment, and I have this saying, who has the goal gets the outcome they want. And I think there's a centre there with many fast food areas that are there in that shopping centre.
Question in here, Councillor Taylor?
It's not a question.
Is there a question?
No, there isn't a question. I want to know how we can turn that into, and I don't believe that any reasonable person in the street would agree with the assessment that this is an extension of the commercial centre. We already have a street there that closes off where the commercial is. It's not just there. It goes over into the next block to the south.
Councillor Taylor, with respect, I know I've been in trouble for this before, but do you want to save this for debate or do you want to ask the officer a question?
Well, there have been people speaking who haven't had a question.
Well, I think
Well,
they
I'm
have had a
asking how
question.
you can... All right, there's a question. How can you ignore... How can we, as a council, through our planning assessments, ignore the potential of a perfect area for medium density to make it a fast food joint? Now, that's my question. And I don't believe expect
I don't
that
know
would
that
be?
we can expect the officer to answer that either. We're looking at what's in front of us. Councillor Carl.
Yeah, just a quick one about the noise through you, Chair, to Luke. Luke, do you know when the noise monitor was set up, basically where it looks like a pool was it set up after the demolition of the houses or while the houses were there?
Thank you, Chair. Councillor, I'm just trying to find the part in the noise report where it talks about the date. Monitoring was done from the 11th to the 19th of November 2020. I'm not 100% sure whether or not any buildings were on site at that particular time. I know the site has been cleared for a little while. I'm happy to take feedback on that from someone. When I was looking at the monitoring data that they produced and whether or not I thought it was a reasonable level, number one, it did appear to be quite low in that the levels themselves were a lot lower than what I would expect to have had to be near a major shopping centre, near a major road. Coupled with that, external data, State Main Roads Department has traffic noise contours on their state-controlled roads. And so equating what we're going to see at receptors versus what the state has modelled as theoretical traffic noise from that site, this is also below that as well. So from my point, I'm happy that the monitoring data provided a baseline level that would be reasonable for the people surrounding to go, here's a compliance limit, point that down, set it in stone, and that's what this development must comply with.
Yeah,
Keeping in mind that compliance does not mean that it's not audible. I will be very, very clear on that if no one was before. This is a level that is set down by what development can do, and development does usually mean a bit more noise. What's the acceptable increase above what we've got originally? And this seems to set it at a reasonable level. It may still be heard, but it should be at a level which is not very different from what is currently there.
Yeah, no, look, the reason why I'm asking whether the buildings were there or not, because if it was, in fact, those levels were taken while the buildings were in place, you would assume, reasonably assume, that those levels are monitored would be lower, therefore their
Yes, correct.
sound level is set lower.
Correct.
The hurdle they have to jump over.
Is
Otherwise,
higher.
vacant
Yes.
block, the noise would radiate quite
Yes.
well across a
Yes,
vacant
those
block.
buildings would have given some attenuation
So we
to
can only hope
the
that
noise
was
logger,
the
and
case.
therefore set the bar higher for them to have to meet a lower criteria.
Thanks, mate.
Okay. Councillor Von Hoff, did you have a question?
No, I've just been listening in. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, good. I'm not sure, Michelle, this might be a question directed to you. So we allow this one that's outside the activity centre. How do we allow not the one next to it? Just as a planning question, I'm not really clear.
It's a great question, and I think Kieran today did a very good job explaining some of the balancing considerations that go into assessing an application like this. And I think some of the things that I would pick up on that Kieran was talking about today is one being this extension to the centre concept. There's North Point itself, but I think, it's also looking at what surrounds the North Point Centre shopping centre itself. In that regard, we know that there is a school opposite. We know that there is a community facility in terms of the sports field. There's the Aldi Centre behind North Point itself that forms part of the bigger centre. There is a car wash, there's a service station. So there's somewhat of a larger node happening here, and I think from that perspective it is quite distinct from other parts of the low, medium density residential zone. The other aspects that were talked about today was, this component of planning a community need, and certainly any future applications would have to also go through similar considerations in that aspect. And I guess there, we as part of the planning review and whatever would also consider, should there be any logical extension to this centre in the future, thinking about population growth and things. So it's a difficult question to answer and give you a definitive of where should this boundary be set, because it's not unusual to see centres may have to change over time to account for changes in our population, whether it's from a growth perspective or a change in our demography. Carol Taylor made a very good point earlier about, there may be opportunities for other housing choice in this locality that would then add additional demand. So I think looking at it from that greater holistic perspective is what sets it apart from other areas in the low medium density zone that do not have similar features within its locality. But it is very difficult for me to say this is the point at which there's no further expansion. It would be assessed on a case-by-case basis, and in that regard it would go through the similar process of engaging with the community through public notification, and having to consider a range of measures about the type of activity that would go there. Does it fit with the scale of the centre? Has there been changes that have required rethinking of the centre that were unknown, and the impacts of any future development?
Let alone understanding the difference between the AOs, the POs and the purpose and overall outcome. No wonder. It's a confusing business. Now, I think we've run out of questions. We are up to presentations from submitters, and we have Mr. David Quinlan has requested to speak. Thank you very much, Kieran. About 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Obviously, I am an employee of council. I have declared my interests. I have not been involved in any way in any of the decision-making at all. However, I do declare my interest. It's on, in fact, to protect council and myself in the role that I have in my substantive position, etc. I do actually register a statement of interests, and you'll see that those two properties are held by a self-managed superannuation fund, 28 and 30 Wattle Street, not 1 and 2 Wattle Street, as Luke indicated earlier. Certainly, it is not consistent with the zone code. We know that. I think we may be getting a bit ahead of ourselves. We do have Toowoomba Futures. We are anticipating through that growth in the area, and it could indeed be that we make it into a centre zone code and we put it blue on the map and we increase the size of it through that process. That way we would have a better outcome going forward, unlike what we saw with the tussle between Super Rooster and North Point, getting them to work together, which we will recall was a bit of a drama. And one of the problems with doing this on its own is it's turning its back towards the rest of it. If we are going to go with the centre zone there, then really we need to do it, I believe, in an integrated fashion. But anyway, it does claim to show consideration for the surrounding residential uses, as Kieran has put in his report, which does surprise me a little that he comes up with that. If we could please look at the drawing DA062. It's the first one in the, yes, that one. Now, interestingly, the decision notice, draft decision notice, seeks to approve 11 drawings, and we only have 5 here before us today. Only 5 of those drawings, which, look, we can all make mistakes, but I suppose that's a very, very poor process, and it's difficult for council to approve something it can't even see. But anyway, let's look at this one. When do you imagine this is the laser? Which button?
Right.
Oh. Doesn't work.
Maybe point it at the screen here, Dave.
Oh, one screen there. Interestingly, you will see this.
The mic, Dave. The mic.
A little bit hard to do both. If I could ask, we can see there it says timber acoustic fence. Can we agree with that? In that drawing that is meant to be part of the approval package today, timber acoustic fence at ground level. That means it's a 2 metre high fence if you read through the acoustic thing, And as you can see, it's in the area which is actually part of the road dedication. So therefore, it's not actually within the property at all, and therefore can't be there. Would you agree that that is a mistake in the drawing in terms of us approving it? I think you would. And it gets better, of course, because we've actually used that layout of the acoustic fence in actually the acoustic report. So if we go to the acoustic report and we look at those sound diagrams, we'll see that it assumes that there's an acoustic fence sitting there in the road reserve right next to the major generation of sound, which is the ingress and egress from the site. As you know, people will come out and roar away as they turn left and screech as they turn right in. So if we were to look at them, we'll actually see that that sound would actually dissipate across that site. That acoustic fence won't be there. So on that basis, the acoustic report is incorrect. Furthermore, the acoustic report just uses sensitive receptors being the actual houses and doesn't actually take into account, as we'll see here, doesn't actually take into account, I don't seem to be able to use the pointer, Madam Chair, I do apologise. But those properties, there's been no taking into account of the recreational areas of those properties in terms of being sensitive receptors. I'd also suggest that if we are talking about medium res, which we are short of, then this area doesn't comply right across the entire site for noise at all, I think Luke would agree. And on that basis, it sterilises the development of those sites for medium res. So is that really something at all? So yes, I can see that we can all make mistakes and not include the drawings that we're seeking to approve today, but really it's a fairly poor level of detailed assessment when we can't even get the actual heights right. Also, the heights of the walls. Kieran couldn't actually indicate before what the heights actually are. Well, I've worked through and it's quite difficult to determine what the heights are. And there is no actual condition about the heights. They're a combined height of the acoustic wall and the retaining wall. And indeed, if we go back to the site layout, Wendy, the picture we had before, to the actual, maybe the one that actually shows the layout. Oh yes, that one just, narrowed down, terribly sorry. If we look on the, how does one make this work?
Something going there for a second.
Oh, there it is, there, we've got it working. Around this area here, you can see that there's a kink in this fence, but I've worked out the height of this wall's over 4 metres. And there's no real way of defining that. So why in the condition set didn't we actually put maximum heights? Now we've seen this before. Now Kieran, you wouldn't know, but we've seen this here and before, that we have something generally in accordance with some drawings. The drawings are a bit oblique and we can't actually define or enforce a maximum height when they're actually built. Not only that, we don't have the dual fence clause where they build the fence, a retaining wall, like say 50 millimetres away from the existing fence, and then rubbish and everything builds up there. Have we got that condition in there? No, we do not. So pretty ordinary. But it gets better. It gets better. We didn't actually include the traffic report. And why is that? Just like we didn't actually include the overshadowing. So up here where we've got this 4 metres, that's obviously an east-west boundary. This doesn't get any sunlight in this area across the whole of the winter. So is that an acceptable impact? Once again, Kieran's report would suggest that it's given consideration, it's been considerate of the surrounding residential uses. I would suggest it isn't. It gets better. Site distance. You won't have the traffic report because it wasn't included. And they didn't include the overshadowing report either in your package, in the agenda item. And I can understand why, because it makes it look pretty good. But let me read something to you from the traffic report where we initially expressed, or there was an expression, perhaps from submitters, about the safety of the egress from the site. Obviously you need sight distance to the west. And yes, there will be a solid fence of some sort because the property boundary is right here. And in the report, that actual verge is a real problem there. It's only about 0.5 metre between the back of the curb and the fence. And in the traffic report, it says that the vehicle is able to safely nudge in inverted commas, forward clear of the eastbound travel lane. So what that means is you sneak out with your car and you can't actually see to the west, but you sneak your car out actually onto the tarmac so you can see to the west before you turn left. Now, yes, if you paint a line there and if it's only a local street and if the traffic isn't too much, you can almost get away with that in certain circumstances. But you can't in this, because now that you've got the left-hand turn lane, people are going to head east and, of course, swing over, hard over to the left because they can see the car in front, moving to the right-hand lane, turning the indicator on. They'll swing to the left and create an accident. True, somebody can look at the standards and draw a line and say maybe it's right, maybe it's compliant. But if it looks bad, if it looks unsafe, it is unsafe.
How you going, Dave? You're getting close?
Yes, I'm moving it quite along, not too far. So why, indeed, do we have these super high retaining walls? The reason we have it is to get stormwater to work. They're having to jack the site to roll the stormwater, and you don't actually have the design of the stormwater in your set. Once again, it wasn't included. But basically, they're tipping the stormwater out into Jones Street. It has to be built in Jones Street, down and into Wattle Street, and then back against grade up to the pit outside of 28 Wattle Street. Now, interesting, they didn't include this in your package, but I see a report back from October where it looked at a number of options from, this is their consultants, who said option 3, running the stormwater line in an easement on the south side of 28 Wattle Street. This is the most straightforward option from a stormwater point of view. However, we understand that it does not have support from the landowner. Well, I've had 2 contacts with the good people of McDonald's. I have been very cooperative. In fact, I was happy to do that deal. But I think they're frightened. I know people don't cooperate with them, and so therefore they haven't considered that. But what we'd be doing by building that sort of stormwater infrastructure, and you'll see in the conditions where I imagine Craig has put in some conditions about minimum clearances, the use of rectangular culverts instead of pipes to get the clearances around the sewers and other services. There's a lot of money there, disruption to the road, manholes in the road, subsidence, they want to use flowable fill, all those problems, and into the future we have the maintenance of that infrastructure and its replacement at some point. Whereas, if it came straight out of the back of the site, if we could just shrink it down again, please, Wendy, we could come straight out of here, down through 28 Wattle, straight to the, it'll all be owned by the developer. We wouldn't have to pay for any of it. They could probably, because it would be in their site, they could use PVC instead of RCPs, and into the back of the chamber in Wattle Street, a much better way to go. So that would be better for council. So I would be in favour of obviously council refusing the decision, but if council is not inclined to refuse the decision, I want to put all my cards on the table here. I think there is a better way and some solution. If the decision is not to refuse and actually have this type of development in this area, then I have, I believe, a much better solution. I'm happy to enter into an agreement with the applicant that they can purchase those 2 properties, 28 and 30 Wattle Street, by getting the stormwater in very easily. They can lower the height of those retaining walls. They could also make a road dedication on 30 Wattle Street, on James Street, to widen up that footpath. After all, we've got all those parks there, the velodrome, which is a major draw card. People can walk up there safely, not in that really narrow, terrible circumstance. And you would be saying, well, Dave, this is in your interest. Are you simply looking to score a whole bunch of money? I'd put it here right here now. I think it's important. Those 2 houses, I'd be happy to sell for 600 something K. That's both of them, not each of them, both of them, which I think in this market is fairly reasonable. It's a much better outcome.
Dave, I've let you go for 12 minutes, a little bit over the 5, so can you wrap it up and maybe take some questions from councillors?
Certainly, Madam Chair, thank you for your indulgence. I'll cut it off there and I'll take some questions if people are interested. Thank you.
Questions for the submitter? Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question's probably not for the submitter, it's probably for our staff and why we haven't got complete reports in here, and it has come at previous things we've gone that have come to us where we have not had traffic reports. I'm not happy. I think we should have everything we need to make a decision here, and if we've only got incomplete diagrams and plans here, I don't know how, are we expected just to accept things at face value? Because as far as I'm concerned, I'm not pointing the finger at anybody else, I don't think it's acceptable.
Thank you, Councillor. Thank you, David. I might have to ask for some clarity from either Kieran or the assessing officer, the assessing traffic engineer. Was the traffic study something that was conditioned as part of this, or is it a reference document for assessment purposes?
For the Chair, the traffic impact assessment is a support document, and I've used that to evaluate the application. There are conditions. It is a reference document in the Department of Transport and Main Roads condition assessment, set of conditions. I've used the traffic report to draft up the conditions and things like traffic, for instance, car parking, for instance. I've used it for that purpose, but it's not actually an approved document as part of the condition set.
Thank you very much. But if it is, TMR is a referral agency, and their report should have been attached, I believe. It used to be, and I believe it should have been.
I'm not sure if the staff can answer that, but I know that there is the referral agency's response as one of the attachments to this document, which is from TMR.
So who is going to perhaps answer some of the questions about the sensitive receptors, the fencing, I was talking about the traffic report, and the overshadowing then, perhaps?
To that also, the fact that the acoustic wall will be on the road reserve, which is not acceptable.
Luke, thank you.
Sorry, Luke, Chair, may I ask a question? Kieran, may you just explain to us, looking at the site plan, it appears that area in Jones Street is currently part of the property, so is it a dedication arrangement, and what would be the implication there in terms of what would be a new setback? Because it looks at that area in red on the site plan, it appears to be a dedication for the road but is currently part of the property. I just want to work out, we'll get some clarity on that. And then Luke may be able to make some comments about how that is considered.
Sure, I probably apologise. I don't know that I can add much clarity to that side of things. I understand it's a resumption for the road, but
the reason I'm asking is the hatching looks quite different here. So we've got a red line of land dedication to suit a 5.5 metre verge, and that is a diagonal hatch. It may be just the transparency, but does that go all the way through, or is it a different type of hatching, and is that part of the property?
Madam Chair, perhaps I could explain. That area, if you went back to the blocks, you'd see that was the original property block. That obviously there's been dedications from the other properties in the past. This is the remaining one there prior to the 30 Wattle Street property, and as part of this, it's been conditioned that that be a dedication to road reserve from the property to widen the road at that point. My point is that you can't have a timber acoustic fence sitting smack in the road reserve. And
so if I could just have a follow-up there. I mean, if that's been dedicated to road reserve, then it needs to stay at road reserve. I might be a little bit confused here, but there is no way that I could support this area. As you can see, this was all residential. And now look at what we have here, and with this proposed to be added to it. So there's no way that we should be minimising the road reserve because Jones Road, as has been seen, is now not adequate and we're adding more there. So there's no way that I would support anything impeding that addition to the road reserve.
I'll just get Michelle to comment there. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I may call around on Craig Thompson if you could answer some questions that I have, actually. So the current property appears to extend further out, and this proposal based on the site plan appears to indicate a road dedication. In the future, with redevelopment of the adjoining parcels to the west, given that Jones Road has from the east of Ruthven Street had dedication and would be a requirement of this one, would there be further dedication of Jones Road in the properties on the west? And picking up on Councillor Carra-Taylor's point here about the increase in traffic and even if it was redeveloped for the intended purpose that, could be considered code accessible for medium density development, would that be likely to be a scenario outcome that the adjoining properties would have to be pushed back?
Excuse me just a minute, Craig. I think that it already is wider to the west because you'll find there's an area there for cars to park on the side of the park.
I'll just get Craig to comment there, sorry.
So if there was another application to assess on the block to the west, I'm confident that we'd be asking for more road reserve and there would be a dedication to match what was outside McDonald's. There is very little verge there at the moment, even for a residential street.
Sorry, Craig, I'm talking about further over the other street where the park is. It's obvious to me that the road reserve is wider there than it is between, Parrot Street? Or no, that street and Ruthven Street, which is what we're dealing with now. I agree with you about that one to the west, Michelle, but I think as you go further west, it's wider.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the history of that is. It looks wider than a residential street needs to be. It's got a very wide verge on the northern side. I don't know that we'd be looking at that much land if there was another application. I'm pretty confident we'd be more likely to match what's outside McDonald's and extend the footpath across those blocks, I think.
Yes, Luke, come and...
Through you, Chair. Could I please have attachment 7, the very last page, brought up on screen? And while I'm speaking with that, yes, that plan that these submitters have noticed with that red area that's on screen right now showing the timber fence and the road reserve, that is an error, okay? The modelling did not include an acoustic fence. Practically, there will be no acoustic fence within the road reserve. What you can see on this screen here, and if you look, this is orientated with north pointing to the left of page, and you can see the property boundaries very clearly demarked, and if you watch the white acoustic fence come down to the bottom, scoot back up, and then to the south, which is where Jones Street ends, the acoustic fence ends very squarely on the property boundary. This is an endorsed report. The acoustic fence will stop there. This is also the cumulative noise model for the site, showing the sources of noise, the traffic flow paths, the areas where people may congregate. The yellow squares and the pink asterisks are speakers, which was a point raised before. The pink lines are the traffic volumes and the queuing areas where traffic will flow. And as you can see from the model, the acoustic fence shears off the noise from that last property on the corner of Jones Street and Wattle Street.
Did you have a response here?
No. If we look at this diagram, and I'm not sure which one of the set it is that you have, Luke, but if we look there, that is indeed the corner of the 30 Wattle Street property, if I'm not mistaken, and that ends it on its boundary. And indeed, the dedication is to there. So that is indeed showing that it extends all the way to the edge of the Wattle Street property, not to the edge of what will be the dedication. Do you wish to have another look at that, Luke?
Sorry, Luke, one question I have is really around the contours of the noise. I'm wondering if you could explain the contours of the noise at that location, because they do come in a little bit there. It's green as opposed to orange. Was there anything that you can identify in that assessment that might give an indication as to why that might be happening at that point in location?
I didn't quite catch the beginning of your question. I apologise.
No, sorry, Luke. In the diagram that's shown here, the reference point that Mr. Quinlan is referring to in the southwest, there's a change in the acoustic contours in this location. We notice that the orange, for example, seems to go in compared to the green, and I'm just wondering if there is any additional information you can shed any information or light in as to why that varies in that location. Is there...
Well, the contours definitely don't match up in terms of the intensity. So orange, for example, if we compare red with red, you can see that the red is a louder noise source than the orange. So on the exit of the property where the acoustic barrier fence, red extends outward, that's a louder noise, extending into the street. Whereas on the properties, the red contour is closer to the acoustic fence. So then we go down into orange, dark green, medium green, light green, yellow. That's indicating lower noise emissions from the site, proving that the acoustic barrier is providing a level of attenuation to the residences to the west.
So, sorry, does somebody have a question? Forgive me, Luke, if I'm asking the same question. So at that point, there was an indication of the acoustic fence going to the boundary? Is that how that's shown in this diagram here?
Yes, it's going to the property boundary.
So if there was a requirement to dedicate a portion of that land, how would that impact with the acoustic fence being brought more northwards to coincide with the dedication? What are we looking at here in terms of that orange and red acoustic? Would there be a change as a result of that?
My opinion would be is if that fence stopped 2 metres shorter, so instead of travelling all the way, it was 2 metres shorter, then that contour that you see in the differentiation where it veers off and you end up with that slight wiggle and the tweaking of it, that line of differentiation would move 2 metres that way, 2 metres towards the north into the other property. Would that have a major increase in the noise levels at where the receptors were noted? Not significant. A point was raised about whether or not our criteria deals with internal acoustic amenity or external. The criteria are measured at specific points within the site, so our day and evening are considered, as per our planning scheme requirements, at the facade of any adjacent receptor for day and evening time. And then at night time, it's measured at a standard which is measured at an indoors point within a particular dwelling, and there's an assumption provided within the noise model that a 7 decibel reduction from exterior noise to interior noise is provided, and that is really quite low. There being, no, and that's actually a good thing for the output of this report. It's not presuming that from the outside of a building, you lose 20 decibels on the inside. They're saying that noise on the outside will only reduce by 7 decibels inside. And that is a low reduction standard applied to a model such as this. Typically, we get 15 decibels reduction. So day and evening, the criteria applies to outdoor spaces at the points that are shown on that particular plan there.
That's the black ones? Sorry, just for my clarity.
Yes, that's the
they're talking
ones
about
that are
black
along
ones being the receptors.
Wattle Street. And then if you stay on that page there, and if you scroll up just a little bit, you can see the black dot near the speakers. So that is where the receptor facade for what is receptor 3. The resident on Ruthven Street immediately to the north of the site, which Councillor Summerfield was the one that you were asking questions about before. Where that mouse pointer is, thank you, exactly. So that's where that facade measurement was taken from. So the criteria within the noise report is based on what the planning scheme asks. The planning scheme asks for indoors or outdoors, depending on the time of day, and facade corrected whether or not they are.
And then the question was raised about the overshadowing drawings or diagrams. Sorry, Councillor Carl, I was going to go to you. I've interrupted you. So who can answer that question? Is that...
Overshadowing is not something that I'm typically involved in. What my role in council is to go to a planner. We've got a retaining wall of X metres high plus a 2 metre or a 2.4 metre acoustic fence. Is that an issue for a planner to consider from an amenity point of view? I know that on this map here, the boundary on the bottom of that page, the thinnest boundary as it extends down, that is a 1.5 metre retaining wall with a 2 metre acoustic fence. And then the retaining wall or on the remainder of that boundary near where that mouse goes ranges from 0.8 of a metre to 0.4 of a metre with a 2 metre high fence on it. So you're looking at a 3.4 metre tall retaining wall plus acoustic barrier fence at its highest point. And down to 2.4 metres the closer you get to Jones Street.
Let's get the Acting General Manager to comment. Yeah.
Forgive me, I don't really have so much as a comment, but perhaps more of a question. I'm not sure for you, Karen, if you're able to answer this or speak to this point. So when we're looking at overshadowing, can you talk about the orientation and the impacts that overshadowing, particularly of buildings, have and the sites that would be impacted? Particularly, I guess, some of the things that concern us in this region is the winter period. Given that we are a different climate to Brisbane, concern about shade on adjoining properties and how far that might extend given the orientation of this particular site?
Yep, so when we look at shadow diagrams, there were some shadow diagrams provided at one point during the assessment of the application. I think it was in response to the last further issues letter, because that was when council was asking the applicant further questions around the interfaces. And so you look at shadow diagrams in the two, I think they call it the two equinoxes, so it's sort of 21 December when the sun's at its highest, and 21, I think it's July, when the sun's at its lowest, and how it moves across the sky, usually nominally between sort of 7 o'clock in the morning, then at midday, and then again at, say, maybe 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And so how those shadows are cast. Obviously, as the sun moves across the sky, I think buildings to the north will have the greatest impact, shadowing for the longest, where structures to the east or west, the shadows might be higher or might be larger, but for less time. And also the difficult thing with shadow diagrams and with some other things we've spoken about today is always a comparison between what is proposed and what would otherwise be the case. So again, 1.8, using a nominal 1.8 metre fence on a boundary, which you'd find in most residential scenarios, that can be more or less. There can be differences in levels. It's comparing that scenario, or indeed if the land were to redevelop for units. Again, there'll be car parking and entrances and things there, and potentially the need for fences. But putting that to one side, if you just look at a residential scenario, it's the comparison between what is or could be there versus what's proposed. So the very fact that there is a shadow is not unexpected. It's how much of the yard is being shadowed. That was a consideration we had. There is some shadowing on the adjoining properties. It was our perspective that that shadowing wasn't excessive, that it didn't go to the houses in particular, and that it was in, we were seeing the worst case scenarios in those sort of winter equinoxes. So those are the considerations we had.
Sorry, Councillor Taylor. Councillor Carr has been waiting very patiently.
Yeah, it was back on the noise attenuation, that diagram. Luke, can you educate me, please? On the left-hand side is the northern boundary, and we see the blue line fence running the full extent there. But I don't quite get, I understand the black dots are receptors, but I don't quite get how the sound attenuates or travels less immediately adjacent loudspeakers and a driveway with vehicles running, as opposed to down the bottom end there in a stationary car park, and yet the sound travels further there. And if you look at the bottom receptor, as opposed to the top receptor on the northern boundary, the western boundary, that receptor is subject to more noise as well. So there seems to be, as in a layman's view of this, some real inconsistencies around that sound modelling.
Through your chair, councillor, there is a higher acoustic fence to that receptor on the northern side, which is the one to the left of the page, and that will have an influence on how noise travels once it crosses that acoustic barrier fence. So when you're seeing, and I hope I'm answering the questions, we can get this
well, yeah,
right.
I get the fence, but I'm not talking about just the fence here as well, because if my understanding and familiarity with the slope of this site, this whole site that slopes away from Rutherford Street, with a combination of a retainer wall with an acoustic fence on top of that, you would think that the sound would be somewhat mitigated because it's way above that receptor. I don't know. I don't know how sound works. I'm not the expert. But it just doesn't seem to make common sense to me that those widths of those sound levels are narrow. I understand what you're saying about the fence is higher, but down the bottom end, the combination of the two, my understanding, which I do have concerns about overshadowing as well, is somewhat considerably higher than a direct interface with the receptor at the bottom.
Yep. So this might go some way to answering your question. It is a 3D model that is being used here, so it is taking into account terrain and landform, et cetera, and being a cumulative model, meaning that it's measuring, and this is only one diagram out of about 6 in this particular report, but it's suitable for a visual representation. The area at the drive-through is going to be slightly higher than the area at the south of it, or to the west of it, sorry, to the lower of the page. So the speaker, the drive-through area, that will be the noisier area of the site. The car park towards the west or the bottom of the page should have a lot less frequency in it. We're not expecting the car park to be full most of the time. So from a modelling point of view, you are going to get some noise leakage from the speaker area and the entry and exit as it starts to go. It will flow down. And that can be one of the reasons why you end up with a slightly wider contour, because of the elevation change throughout the length of the site, compared to an area right next to the drive-through speakers, that receptor to the north on Ruthven Street, where you've got noise sources, acoustic barrier fence, house, all basically at the same ground level.
Councillor Carol Taylor.
Remember what I can't remember what I was even going to say now. We were told, I think, by Mr Quinlan that there was going to be a fence that was 6 metres high. Is that the case? Can I ask, please?
Through you, Madam Chair. No, I don't believe it's 6 metres high.
Oh, how much What?
But I certainly believe in this area here, it's certainly up round 4 metres.
Which is...
Luke's making the comment that down here it goes, you know, I think it's about 2.8 metres, just adjacent to the basin. But my point would be, if that is the case, if there are those heights there, then specify them so that they cannot be exceeded. Because we've had developments in the past where we go there, we thought we were going to get 2 metres.
I understand. Yeah, thank you. And I'm quite familiar with Brule and Style, with the noise meters, because I had a boarding kennel. So, you know, at the end of the day, I guess that we say the car park's not going to be full, but the car park over here on Margaret Street is very often full, and it's also got cars like XU1s and others that have very noisy exhausts. So I just don't know how that can all be encompassed. I'm not convinced. Thanks.
Councillor Summerfield?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thanks, staff, for putting up with all our questions. It's very complex and it impacts many people. It impacts the developer and it impacts the people around there. I just wondered, so just understanding the acoustic side of it is all done on a computer program, is that right? It's all developed up like that? And I'm not knocking that, I'm just needing to understand that.
Through you, Chair, Councillor, it's a combination of, well, the monitoring was done on site physically, someone put a logger on the site. The modelling is done through a combination of all the site diagrams, drawings, etc., inputted into the model. So what you're seeing on screen is a computer-generated model.
Okay,
They haven't built it yet, so they can't take any noise monitoring from this particular development and see what they're doing.
Yeah, so the on-site monitoring would really be only just general traffic noise. It's not going to be able to collect a car driving in and then do you want chips with that on a loudspeaker?
That was not the purpose of the monitoring. The purpose of the monitoring was to figure out what the noise was without this development occurring. And then it adds, the planning scheme adds a little bit
Yeah,
and says, here's your ceiling.
yeah,
Can you show that you can operate below that?
all right.
And that's when we check all their noise inputs into the model.
So I did the naughty thing and did a bit of Googling and I looked at Ackland Coal Mine and they have a restriction of 37 decibels between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. How does that sit with, by comparison to what we're dealing with here, just so I can understand that comparison?
The nighttime noise levels are, for variable noise, 47 decibel, so it's 10 decibel more. Ackland, without looking into it, but having done a few noise reports and modelling for mine sites before joining council, that area, they would be basing it on also background plus criteria. So what is their noise without the mine? And then they have their criteria like what we do and have our normal standard criteria. And then Ackland Mine would have had to do their own noise modelling based on pits and workshops and offices, etc., etc. So 10 decibel difference from prior to Ackland even being there, what would be a predominantly rural area. Nighttime 37 decibels is actually reasonably loud. It's probably what I've got at my house in the suburbs, away from commercial areas.
Okay, thank you.
Type thing.
Appreciate
So
that.
47 decibels is the noise level outside the person's house, and the noise levels are set up at night time, presuming that 99% of the people in Queensland will sleep somewhere between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. So therefore, it equates to that level inside, which is where that 7 decibel reduction of the noise outside. So if you have a very, very modern, well-built home, you might have 20 decibels reduction from internal.
Very confusing. Thank you. Look, Madam Chair, I'm really concerned. I've got a lot of questions that I feel we haven't been able to answer today. And rather than risk council making a decision that's going to impact various people in whatever way, I'm just wondering whether we shouldn't defer this and get some more information brought to the table. Would that be appropriate or not?
I would imagine I'm just needing some guidance on how to do that, yeah? So we just need to, Councillor Summerfield needs to move that, we defer it? Oh, yeah? Okay. Councillor Carr?
further to Councillor Nancy's question, are we afforded the time under the application process?
Good question.
I would have to ask one of the staff to advise on where this is at in processing timeframes, please.
Because we don't want to get into a deemed approval situation. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, so the application's impact assessable, so there's no risk to council of a deemed approval.
Righto.
The only risk to council is that the applicant didn't agree to a further extension of time. If we were in a position to make one, I'm not sure of the exact date. The only risk to council is that they would appeal against, basically saying that council's failed to make a decision on the application. But I don't know if it's my place to speak to that. It's low risk would be my advice.
Madam Chair, if I could, this is live streamed. People are watching, and that comment's been made. And I don't want to see council exposed, but I do feel we haven't been provided enough information on this application. That's just my view personally. I just feel I've got unanswered questions, and I do apologise. I had an emergency earlier and had to leave, but I'm just not comfortable that there's enough information there for me to make a decision. But we have 11 councillors in the room, and it's not solely me, so we need to know where we really stand. Are we exposing council in any way if we do defer for more information?
The Principal Planner is going to speak to this and provide some more information.
Thank you. Through the Chair, councillors, I suspect there's a very low risk of failing to make a decision resulting in a deemed refusal. This is an impact assessable application, so if a decision isn't made today and the timeframes in the DA rules, so effectively the timeframes we've got to make a decision are exceeded, the applicant would need to take council to the Planning Environment Court to challenge a deemed refusal. So it's very low risk, I suspect, where there is a clear intention to seek additional information that the councillors may think that they require to make an informed decision, and the applicant agrees to cooperate. If the applicant is uncooperative, it may be difficult to get additional information from them. However, I do note that there are some inconsistencies in the plans, particularly the section of road reserve dedication and the acoustic barrier that clearly can't be put in that section of the site. So I would say it may be reasonable if council did determine that they weren't going to vote on the application today, that council officers could obtain some further clarification around the acoustic impacts. If the acoustic barrier was about 4 metres or so shorter to account for the road dedication that's required. And I might ask if there are any other questions, specific questions that councillors are seeking information on. We could get some clarification around that so officers know precisely what to ask for.
I think the overshadowing is probably one of the questions. Councillor Carl? That was yours, yeah. Councillor
And the traffic
Taylor?
report, thank you.
The traffic report,
The traffic report, the overshadowing and the situation with the, as you've mentioned, Chris, the road reserve dedication and the acoustic barrier being, and I'd also like some information on the exceedance, what we don't want them to exceed in height with the acoustic barrier.
Yeah, thank you, councillors. So council officers can seek some further clarification on this, and it may be possible then to bring this same report with amendments at a future date for council's consideration.
Okay, Councillor Carl, you just had a further...
And in addition, just to be clear, from my mind, we want to qualify or specify the fence, acoustic fence heights, and that's the overall impact of a retaining wall with the fence on top of that, and what sort of setback there is from boundary on that. The other thing that I would, open to council's agreeance on it, but some further discussion around site layout to help further mitigate impacts of noise and amenity, loss of amenity to adjoining neighbours.
Through the chair, councillor, I'm not quite sure how we would address changes to the site layout.
Particularly,
to address
I'm thinking about where cars pull up and those loud hailers say, can I take your order, please? And would you like fries with that? Maybe that could be located in a different part of the site, understanding that there is a circular motion of traffic required for a drive-through. So maybe it could be located at a different point on this site with a rejig.
The Acting General Manager to comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Councillor Carl, would some additional information about whether the applicant has already considered those aspects as part of their preparation of the proposed site layout and what they took into account in reaching this position be something that would address that request for information, or would you be seeking to actually ask the applicant to amend the site plan in a particular way?
I'm leaning towards amending the site plan in a particular way. In other words, trying to remove the stop-start section of that with the loud hailers from that northern boundary to another part of the site, and that's up for their consideration. Given that, and it may mean the orientation of the building changes, it may mean the internal layout of the building changes. I don't know. That's their
I would, a significant change like that would require almost all reports, technical reports, to be recalibrated to a new layout. That would be a significant amount of effort required for the applicant. And I'm thinking about the comments that were made a bit earlier in relation to the trade-offs that are made, particularly in relation to queuing distances versus its impact assessment. And I'm wondering whether some additional qualifying information may also be helpful as to, was this particular site layout, derived for considerations on a range of measures that and why?
Well, the reason why I'm erring towards what I just said was the planner. When I asked the question before, the planner said that no, there was no consideration given to the position of a different site layout. There was no discussion about that. And so therefore, in the interests of protecting amenity in the immediate vicinity, adjoining neighbourhood, I think we need to exhaust all those options. And to me, that hasn't been explored.
Madam Chair, may I ask the assessing planner, Kieran, to perhaps provide some additional insight and advice in relation to this aspect?
I think, I don't know if I can add too much to the discussion at this point. It's within council's powers, I guess, to ask the applicant to amend it. I'd amend the layout. I share some concerns earlier, not so much about the amount of work for the applicant. That's a call, that's a decision for them to make, whether they go to that work or choose not to. Part of my concern would be that they'd have to revisit public notification. And I say that as a concern that might be something that leads an applicant to decide not to do it. And the only other comment I would make there is that if we're asking the applicant to amend the design, just being really clear about what we're trying to achieve. And so is that an acoustic improvement? Is it a visual improvement? Is it a queuing improvement? what are we trying to achieve by getting them to adjust the design to suit?
I think I've outlined it fairly clearly, is to mitigate where possible, or as much as possible, the immediate impacts of having that driveway abutting a residential boundary as opposed to two other boundaries that are an option there. And you made a comment about going back to notification. I'd struggle to think that they would have to go back to a notification period, given that the type of activity isn't changing, and it's still going to be a McDonald's restaurant or a drive-through. So I would argue that they would actually need to put a notice up again. It's simply based on amenity and a reasonable expectation that you would try and put as much distance between residential neighbours to the hotspots of what I would call the hotspots of that site development, which is immediately abutting to residential properties. So I would ask that and because that option has not been asked, is my understanding, I don't think we've explored the options in the best interests of residential community, of which this is an impact application for a change of use. So I'd like to see us ask that of the applicant as well in consideration because of amenity, noise impact, but basically to try and minimise those impacts.
Sure, I appreciate your comments around amenity and trying to get the use as far away from the boundary as possible. And just to finish on the notification point, the test that the applicant will face, because this is not an info request, and it's not a matter that was raised in submission. It's a request coming from council after that. The test they'll be facing is the minor change test, which is outlined in the legislation and the DA rules, and it talks to substantial changes to layout and parking and manoeuvring and things of that nature. So again, these are all matters for the applicant to deal with, not for myself and not for council. I guess I'm just running up the flagpole the risk that they would take a risk-adverse approach to that, given it is an impact assessable application, there are submitters, and taking a risk-adverse approach and looking at that criteria, they might determine it necessary to go back through public notification.
Well, I think I'm representing the interests of a community who have a reasonable expectation or want a degree of certainty about the neighbourhood they live in and the impacts of changes such as these down the track that no one in their right mind would even entertain. And further to that, just Madam Chair, if I may, on the issue of loss of amenity, Councillor Taylor raised it before, is the availability for the future, not just the amenity now, but the amenity into the future. And I know we're dealing with this application as it is here and now. But if you go back to that aerial photography of the general vicinity, and if you were actually to spread it out even more, there is very limited opportunity for this, and I note the Acting General Manager's comments about this being a serious node. Well, for us not to make the same mistakes again about turning a major node into a transient, what I'd call a transient node, where population through traffic picks up convenience, food and other services, rather than have medium density immediately abutting major nodes where you take people off roads and they have everything at their fingertips, as Councillor Taylor has suggested, schools, parks, shopping centres. That's the reason as well, a broader undertaking of or an understanding of the loss of amenity with this type of higgledy-piggledy development outside of the intent of the area.
Okay. Councillors, I'm going to just run through the process, which is Robert Dodman, who's another one of the submitters. Do you reserve the right? Do you think there's anything more that you'd like to add? You'll have to come up, Robert.
Thank you. My concerns really relate just totally to the traffic issues, and I have some couple of diagrams that I prepared after taking some photographs yesterday. I didn't realise I could have them as an electronic form, so I only have 3 copies, which are floating around somewhere. On the page 2 of that submission, you can see Jones Street, and on the right-hand side is the entrance to Coles, and on the left-hand side, somewhere just about where that curbing finishes, would be the entrance to the proposed McDonald's site. And at the bottom of that, you can see, as I've pointed out, that there are 6 cars in that queue and 1 waiting to come out of the Coles North Point exit. The information that I have at the moment, and I would be interested to find out what the Department of Main Roads is proposing, but I timed the traffic phases yesterday, and the exit time from Jones Street onto Ruthven Street is about 20 to 25 seconds, which allows 5 or 6 cars to get through, and the last one on the yellow light or the red light, depending on how worried they are about getting out onto Ruthven Street. So that is as it is now, and the phase for the Ruthven Street lights is about 1:20. So given that at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, between 3 and 5, those lanes are packed, jammed full with people heading to Highfields, I can't see how Main Roads is going to be happy about reducing the length of that phase in Ruthven Street to allow more people to get out of Jones Street. It would seem to me there's already traffic chaos along there from from Jellicoe Street through North Street and out beyond with the amount of traffic. So it would be interesting to know what Main Roads is proposing. On the diagram that was there, which shows the site, I note that there's quite a deal of frontage on Ruthven Street, and I often have wondered why they haven't allowed for some pull-off lanes there. You could get 10, maybe 6 or 7 or 8 cars pulled off there going straight into the site from Ruthven Street. I presume there are good reasons for that. So anyway, I have some questions. Oh, just bearing also what other thing that came up was when was the information provided to the public and when were the houses removed. I note that the notification went up on November the 17th, 2021, and around about that time I photographed the sign so that I could put in my objection, and at that stage all of those houses had been removed. So if that relates to the sound measurements, that might answer some of those questions, because I think we were told they were done in 2020. Who? 21? Somebody mentioned that date before. Yeah, so that's 12 months before the houses were removed. Oh, well, no, 12 months earlier than when I know the houses had gone. So presumably the houses were still there, but that's not proof. So my questions, if I can find the right piece of paper. He said...
Clarify that, so that would make no difference if the houses were there or they weren't there. Is that right?
I understood from what was said that...
Sorry, can I just ask Luke that question?
Yes.
Thanks.
Question to the Environmental Officer, Luke.
That's okay.
Luke, the question was the removal of the houses, would they have made a difference to the acoustic report?
Thank you, Chair. Councillor, I believe that the houses being present would have actually lowered the noise, and therefore that would have made it slightly harder for the applicant to prove that they could be compliant. Because it lowers the threshold of noise measured, and that's when we set our limit, noise limit, and then the modelling must fit under that limit.
So, Luke, just for clarity, if the houses remained there, they would be shielding more noise from Ruthven Street. So the internal noise levels in the site with the houses' presence would be much lower. And therefore, when the noise assessment was considering the new use, how would that work?
It would have had some effect in reducing the noise level. I wouldn't say it would reduce it by 20 decibels, but it would certainly not make it louder. And my opinion is it would have made it lower.
Thank you, Robert. Interrupted you.
So,
had a couple of questions.
A question about the exit from Jones Street into Ruthven Street for the proposed left turn lane. Is there a slip lane there, or is that just, is that a slip lane shown on that diagram? No. So they have to wait for the lights to change. Okay. So, at the moment, cars that exit North Point can either go into the turn left or right at the intersection. When the additional lane is added, cars coming out of North Point, will they be able to cross over so that they can turn left into Ruthven Street if they want to go to Highfields? And likewise, if they come out from McDonald's, will they be able to get into the right turn lane so that they can go south to the city?
Craig, are you able to answer that? I would imagine that's a yes.
So just to clarify, the first question related to a slip lane on Jones Street. There is no slip lane. A slip lane is a left turn lane where traffic can exit independent of the lights. They just have to give way to everybody else. So there's nothing like that as part of this application. The next question was, can traffic exiting the McDonald's turn left and right? Yes, there is no reason why they can't exit out of McDonald's and turn left into Ruthven Street and right into Ruthven Street. The third question was related to the existing shopping centre, and all turn movements can happen there, so they can still turn left into Jones Street and right into Jones Street and select the lane that they need.
Just a comment on that. Of course, if there's only room for about 6 cars there and both lanes are currently filled, it would make it somewhat difficult for people coming out to change those lanes. That's the point, so that further traffic congestion. And then finally, will the flow of cars moving along Ruthven Street to Highfields be restricted from time to time as cars in Jones Street queue to enter both North Point and McDonald's? In other words, when all the car spaces in Jones Street are filled, being about 5 or 6 cars, and more cars want to come into that single lane going down to North Point or into McDonald's, what is going to happen if those cars in Ruthven Street are forced to stop because there's a car in front of them wanting to turn left and they can't?
I would imagine that's something that DTMR has modelled, but Craig, you have an answer for that?
Madam Chair, can I make a comment? DTMR own X amount. They would have control of that intersection, I would think, right back to the turn-off to McDonald's. So it makes a good point because we've got the same issue at that service station on West Street and Russell, near that roundabout, and we've got had the same problem with Zaraffa's Coffee. So people are out on the highway. That's what happens.
Did you want to comment there, Craig?
I'm not sure I fully understood the question, but...
If Jones Street's all full and people are heading north to go to Highfields.
This lane here is filled with cars and there's traffic going along Ruthven Street. Somebody in Ruthven Street wants to turn left into Jones Street and there's nowhere for them to go. They're just going to stop and that'll stop the traffic behind them.
So remember they're putting an extra lane on Jones Street, and the queue lengths are estimated to be 35 metres, which only brings you back to the existing crossing point at the existing shopping centre. So the traffic modelling doesn't predict any queuing beyond that 35 metres, and we've got extra capacity for traffic to queue on Jones Street under this proposal. Also, the changes in the signals are providing additional capacity as well, because at the moment, there is a right turn filter, for instance, from Ruthven Street into Jones Street, and that causes delays for right turning traffic. So by changing the signals and giving that vehicle movement priority, it can actually improve the efficiency of the signal. So even though we might be introducing more lanes, more phases, we're not necessarily making the signals any more, losing any efficiency. Now, this is something that has been discussed, approved by the Department of Transport and Main Roads. They have another application that they have to do in terms of the detailed design, which will include changing the brain and the signals, if you like, to recognise the different phasing. And it will also be coordinated with the signals to the south at North Street. So I'm confident that based on the assessment, the traffic assessment done, there won't be the queuing issues that people are talking about.
Can I make a comment there? TMR have taken all the filters, which is, councillors may not understand that. There'll be no right turn lane on, you won't be able to turn right. You know how there's a red arrow and then it fades on our roads? TMR don't have that. They're getting rid of all of those, and that's their policy. So there will be no right-hand lanes in or out of here with arrows, and you will only if there's an arrow will you be able to turn. You won't be able to turn on a green light. There'll be a red arrow there, so it's just going to add to congestion regardless. I mean, I suppose they've been told they've got to go and retrofit this, and so they're doing it, but it won't be an advantage.
Councillor McMahon, did you have a question for
Chair, look,
Mr
I
Dodman?
suppose just to weigh in on where we are, the current dialogue between the submitter and the office is probably not helping us make our decision terribly much, and I suppose we're at the...
No, that's your right, Mr Dodman, to have your say, yeah.
I'd like to hear from the submitter, and then I'm happy to move we reinstate standing orders.
I don't think there's anything further that I can
Okay,
add at this
appreciate,
stage.
yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Councillor Carl.
Madam Chair, as I see it, before we go into standing orders, reinstate standing orders, there's two positions we have. We either refuse based on lack of information, that for us to make a proper informed decision, or we defer and ask for additional information. That's the two options I see.
Okay.
And if we're asked to consider the application as is before us, based on some of the information that was provided by submitters, then I would suggest, my personal feeling is, we have an obligation probably to refuse the application based on those, that lack of information, detailed information, and also some other ones that I could probably suggest.
Yeah, sure. I think I know where you're coming from. Councillor Summerfield.
Yeah, thank you. Look, I feel the same way. But the other thing that I sort of had in mind was consideration given to reduced hours. So I don't know whether all McDonald's in Toowoomba are 24/7, but that's a huge thing in a residential area to have something operating 24/7 like that. I just wonder whether that was given consideration as well, or whether that was an option or a condition that could be considered. I just don't feel we've got the information we need to make the decision we need, based on the fact that it can impact on people so much.
So just to that last question, Chris, about consideration for hours.
Through the chair, yes, councillor. If council felt strongly about reduced hours of operation, that's something that could be conditioned.
so we can add that to the list of things that are asked for consideration?
So that could be a condition of approval, if an approval is given. It could also be something that is then negotiated or appealed if McDonald's was adamant that they required 24-hour operation.
Okay, well, to ensure that that's considered, if council decides that it wants to go ahead and make a decision today, I would be proposing that a condition be put in place, and whether that be that they can't operate from 10 p.m. till 6 a.m. or something like that. I'd take your guidance on what those hours restrictions should be, but I just think it's too big an impost on those residential areas there.
Well, we might see what happens when we come out of standing orders, because I think there's a fair bit of sort of disquiet about making a decision today. But Councillor Von Hoff, did you have anything that you wanted to ask before we reinstate standing orders?
The only thing I was going to say was in the additional information, I think one of the reports that Mr Quinlan mentioned that wasn't present was also the stormwater report.
I asked this question earlier, and it was relating to what's contained in conditions because they're being approved and the reports are being approved versus what you're expecting to receive as information that has supported the application. So the advice in relation to the traffic report was that it has informed the assessment and it has informed some of the conditioning by main roads, but it has not been a requirement of the condition in the council's draft or the proposed conditions here. I would have to take advice from the assessing officer or other staff in relation to the requirements for stormwater.
Through the chair,
Thanks, Acting GM. I did hear you speak about that previously with regard to the traffic report.
Through the chair, I would say that there's a lot of information submitted in a development application. It can run to many hundreds or thousands of pages. So what council assessing officers try to do is to provide enough detail in an assessment report and make particular reference to documents that are critical for the councillor's information. That would be our general approach. And sometimes maybe our calibration is a little out. Sometimes, like for example today, councillors are expressing a great deal of interest in a couple of detailed questions that maybe are addressed in some of the reports that was submitted for the assessment. I would be cautious about including lots of reports simply for the sake of completeness, because we could be looking at a 3,000-page report for one item.
Could I make a suggestion, Madam Chair? And that was what I suggested earlier, was a map in relation to traffic management. You know, like we've had maps before, which have got the helicopter view, what lanes are there, what management can happen. Would that help rather than be putting a full traffic management report attached to a document?
Through the chair, yes. Sometimes plans that detail specific elements that have been considered in the assessment can be quite helpful. Yes, that's your point is taken, councillor.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Now, I don't think there's anyone representing the applicant here. No. Okay. So with that, can I have someone, thank you, Chris, move that we reinstate standing orders? Councillor McMahon and Councillor Taylor, all those in favour? Okay, so the recommendation is there before you. Does someone want to move the recommendation that council approve the application?
I'd like to move an alternate recommendation that council not approve the application.
Are we deferring for a consideration at a future meeting?
No, that we, based on the information as presented, we're asked to consider as a council an application that's before us. I'm moving. If it lapses for a seconder, so be it. Then we debate. No doubt if I get a seconder, we may debate at this stage.
Thank you, Councillor. Officers would be seeking, or the assessing officer would be seeking some advice about the reasons for refusal, and I'm understanding that it's because you feel that there is insufficient information on which to make a full assessment.
That's one. Another one is a loss of amenity, residential amenity, and impacts. The other one would be I don't believe the application process has exhausted all options as far as site layout, as indicated by the assessing officer, to ensure that there are minimal or impacts are mitigated as much as possible. Just because there's a preferred site layout for the applicant doesn't mean to say that it's in the best interests of the immediate impacted residential property owners.
So Councillor Carl has moved that the application be refused and given those reasons. Does he have a seconder? Okay. So
Happy to move an alternate, well, it's not an alternate recommendation, it'll be another recommendation that we defer, and hopefully there's some wording up there, defer this decision to a further special meeting.
hang on a second, Councillor McDonald. Wendy's needs to go back to the it's Councillor Carl's motion has failed for a lack of a seconder.
It's lost, yeah.
Sorry, we'll just get these up there.
And through you, Chair, Acting GM Nick, the loss of residential amenity is in relation to the status quo now, but the residential land available for future development of medium density. I don't know whether that's permissible. Chris, I'll take your advice as a planner.
Through the Chair, the compromising future amenity.
Yes.
Do you want to have that as your number one, loss of residential
Loss
and future?
And compromise of future residential amenity and land availability or land bank.
And did you want and lack of detailed information in the report?
That's correct.
So is that a number 3?
Yeah.
Is that it?
Number 3 changed to Councillor Cardew about the lack of information in the report.
Well, based on the officer's comments, I possibly would err with caution, given the thousands of pages, as he explained. But I do believe there was, let's put that, because I do believe there was lack of clarity around the site plans on fence heights, overshadowing, and what was the other one? Storm water, and the effective dealing with that, and the potential cost to council in the future around asset management.
Does that get it, Councillor Carr, number 3?
Yeah, I guess if someone noted those 3 points, because it may actually come back to us in another form by the sounds of it. But
So it's the stormwater.
lack of clarity around stormwater management and the effectiveness and potential future impacts to council around asset management of that asset. Lack of clarity around stipulated fence heights in combination with the retaining walls and setbacks. And what was the other one?
Overshadowing.
Overshadowing. Lack of clarity around overshadowing.
Okay. So back to you, Councillor Councillor McDonald.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Motion that the application be deferred to a future special meeting of council. This matter be deferred for consideration of future special meeting to allow further information to be provided in relation to traffic studies. Yes, that was one. Impact to amenity as a result of shadowing, height of acoustic fencing and retaining wall, and Jones Street Road dedication. That covered it, didn't it?
Could I suggest in consideration of opening hours? Or will we leave that and make it a
It'd be a condition
potential
anyway,
condition later?
Yeah.
I also had a similar question around, we said we couldn't do a whole nother report around site layout, but if there's any way it can be reconfigured so that the cars aren't in the northern fence there, is that something we might put in?
I think probably if the applicant's watching this, they might get that message. I'm not sure that would be something that you'd put in a motion, to be fair.
No, that's all right. I'm just
I'm
asking.
sure in discussing the outcome of today with the applicant and seeking their further information and agreement to have this come back to council for further consideration, we will have some discussions about those issues with the applicant.
Thanks. I'm happy to move that.
You're moving that, Councillor McDonald. Is there a seconder? Councillor Antonio. Okay. Did anyone want to move into debate? Councillor Antonio. Yeah. Okay, so that's the motion. All those in favour? As carried. Councillor Carl, you're against? Councillor Carl's against. Oh, Councillor Von Hoff?
In favour, thank you.
Yep. Okay. And Councillor Carl's voted against, yeah. Okay, with that, it's almost a record. We'll close the meeting, 4:54.